A man claiming to be a flight instructor crashed shortly after takeoff, killing the student pilot that was flying with him. And the truth about how this happened and what he said after the crash is one of the most shocking stories that I've covered on this channel. So sit back and get ready, because the more you learn, the worse the story gets. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. Before we dive into all the details about how this tragedy happened, I want to take a moment to honor the memory of the student pilot that died in the crash. 49-year-old Keith Kozel was a student pilot that had about 50 hours of flight time and was in the final stages of his training to get his private pilot certificate. This wasn't Keith's first time flying with this so-called instructor, but unfortunately it was his last, when moments after takeoff something terrible happened and their aircraft crashed into the trees and fell to the ground. The man on the plane with Keith managed to survive, but tragically the aircraft quickly became engulfed in flames and Keith died. There was just no excuse for this. Keith had no idea of the danger he was in. The system failed him and he deserved better. He left behind a family, including 2 daughters, and I can't imagine what they've had to go through. Keith trusted the FAA, he trusted the flight school where he was getting his lessons, and he trusted that the man sitting next to him on the plane that day was a qualified flight instructor. 34-year-old Philip Everton McPherson II was the man sitting next to Keith on the day of the flight, and according to public records, Philip began his aviation journey as a student pilot on January 12, 2018, about 4 years prior to this crash. He completed his first student pilot solo in October of 2018, and then about 6 months later, in April of 2019, he earned his private pilot's license. Philip would continue to fly over the next 8 months, and eventually on December 7, 2019, after failing multiple practical exams, he earned his commercial pilot certificate with an instrument rating. In case you're wondering, a practical exam is just another name for a check ride, and it's a combination of an oral exam and a flight evaluation. Unfortunately, we don't know any further details about which exams he failed or why, but we do know that Philip continued to pursue his interest in aviation, and 3 months later, on March 11, 2020, he received his flight instructor certificate. The most important thing you need to know about this certificate is that there's a note on the back of it that says valid only when accompanied by pilot certificate. That means he had 2 certificates that look just like these. The one on the left is a pilot certificate, and the one on the right is the flight instructor certificate, and you have to carry both of these when you're instructing students. We're going to talk more about this later, but before we do that, you need to understand what happened the first time Philip crashed a plane. On November 18, 2020, Philip was working as a flight instructor, and he took off with a student pilot to conduct a routine training flight out of the Central Jersey Regional Airport. Just to be clear, the student wasn't Keith, because this was almost 2 years prior to that tragedy. At this point in time, Philip had been a flight instructor for almost 8 months, and he had over 600 hours of total flight time. The aircraft they were flying in was a 1978 Cessna 172, and there was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft that contributed to the crash. The truth is that the biggest threat to their flight that day was the weather. The airport they were flying out of didn't have any weather reporting capabilities, but investigators discovered that the Somerset Airport, located just 7 miles away, was reporting clear skies and winds from the northwest at 13 gusting to 25 knots. The reason this is important is because if the winds were the same at the airport where Philip was at, then that meant it was going to be almost a direct crosswind with gusts up to 25 knots for takeoff and landing, which is going to play a big role in the crash. According to the NTSB, the student pilot performed the takeoff and the flight to the training area was relatively uneventful. However, during their return, Philip determined that he would be the one to fly the approach and land the aircraft because he said the winds were forecast to be beyond the student's capabilities. As Philip began the first approach, he got about 100 feet off the ground, and that's when the wind started to blow them off the runway center line and Philip performed a go-around. That would have been a great time for Philip to reassess the winds. All he needed to do was look down at the windsock to figure out the wind speed and direction. I'm assuming he checked that before he took off, and he should have looked at it again after performing the go-around, and that's because according to the Cessna 172 handbook, the maximum demonstrated crosswind for takeoff or landing is 15 knots. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a legal limit. It's just the manufacturer's way of saying this is the limit that we recommend if you want to stay safe. And if you exceed that limit and you crash, then it's up to you to explain to the insurance company and everyone else why you exceeded the limit. I'll talk more about this crash in a second, but first it's important to understand that when the NTSB contacted Philip about the crash, he declined to be interviewed but said that his attorney would provide a statement. That letter never said how strong the winds were, but admitted it was a direct 90-degree gusting crosswind, and it went on to explain how Philip successfully taught another student to land in the event of an engine failure with direct crosswinds in the mid-20 knot range, and that Philip had routinely landed in higher crosswinds without issue. Additionally, instead of just sticking to the facts, the letter almost seemed to try and defend Philip, saying that he's an exemplary CFI that takes pilotage seriously and makes safety his top priority. In fact, Philip's philosophy is, if you're in doubt, go around, and if you're not comfortable, find another airport with a runway that would diminish or eliminate the crosswind. Honestly, that sounds like something I've said in my other videos, and personally, I think Philip should have listened to his own advice. Because after that first go-around, he should have realized the winds were probably too much, and he knew that there were 3 other airports nearby that he could have easily diverted to. This would have been a great lesson for a new student pilot about how maybe the winds got stronger after they took off, and now he needed to figure out how to assess the winds using the windsock, how to make a decision to divert, and how important safety is. Instead, Philip had no reason to believe he wasn't skilled enough to handle the direct crosswind, and he decided to try the approach one more time. During that second attempt, as the aircraft was about to land, it drifted to the left, away from the runway center line. He said he used right aileron and full right rudder, but the aircraft kept drifting to the left until it departed the runway. The tire tracks continued for 430 feet until the nose wheel hit the edge of a crossing taxiway and broke off and the aircraft flipped over. The NTSB said the probable cause was the pilot's failure to maintain directional control while landing in a gusty crosswind. Fortunately, the student survived without any injuries, but this is just the beginning of Philip's story because things are about to get a whole lot worse. That first crash happened in November of 2020, and government documents revealed that 4 months later, Philip was allegedly involved in another accident on March 6, 2021. Unfortunately, no details were provided regarding that incident, and I couldn't find anything in the NTSB database or through other searches, but my guess is something must have happened because 1 month later, in April of 2021, Philip went to work for another flight school called ProFlight Aero. My guess is that when he was hired, they probably had no idea about Philip's previous mishaps, but we'll never know for sure because ProFlight Aero is now permanently closed, and the NTSB didn't provide any details on this during the course of their investigation. What we do know is that around this same time, the FAA received a safety hotline complaint about Philip. If you're not familiar, just Google FAA Safety Hotline, and anyone can go to the FAA website and fill out the online form if you have a safety concern or want to report something. The details of that complaint weren't released to the public, but the FAA thought it was serious enough that they assigned an aviation safety inspector, also known as an ASI, to investigate. Based on that investigation, the ASI concluded that the FAA had reason to question Philip's competence as a certificated airman and that re-examination of his qualification was necessary in the interest of safety. That's why on May 20th, the FAA sent Philip what's commonly referred to as a 709 letter. This is not a letter you want to receive because it's the FAA's way of saying we have some concerns and we need you to do a check ride with us so we can evaluate you. Usually you have 15 to 30 days to respond to the letter, and if you don't, you run the risk that the FAA is going to revoke your certificates. For some reason, Philip never responded to the 709 letter, and about 40 days later, the FAA called him on July 1st to get the check ride scheduled. I think the FAA should have also called the flight school Philip was working for and told them what was going on, but it's not clear if that happened. So it's possible the flight school had no idea about any of this, and in the meantime, Philip continued to fly and instruct students. Eventually, the check ride was conducted almost 2 months later on September 29th, and the purpose was to evaluate Philip's takeoffs and go-around procedures. Now, during that flight, Philip failed the go-around portion of the exam, and the ASI had to assume control of the aircraft or the plane would have crashed. After he failed the check ride, the FAA told him he had the opportunity for a re-examination, but Philip never requested one. Instead, about a week later, on October 7th, he signed paperwork to voluntarily surrender his pilot certificate, and he provided it to the FAA, and that should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't. That's because that same day, the FAA issued Philip a temporary airman certificate that was good for 30 days. Think of this as like a student pilot certificate because it allowed Philip to fly by himself or to hire an instructor to fly with him so he could get remedial training, but it specifically prohibited him from carrying passengers. This meant Philip was no longer permitted to perform services as a flight instructor. Now, here's the problem with this scenario. Remember, Philip has two certificates. He surrendered his commercial pilot certificate, but he held on to his flight instructor certificate even though he couldn't legally use it. And this is where I think the FAA should have taken that away from him too. Because if you can't safely fly an aircraft, then there's no reason you should get to keep your flight instructor certificate until you can prove you're competent and safe. Additionally, I think the FAA needed to do three more very important things. First, they should have followed up with the flight school so the flight school would know not to let Philip work with their students. Second, they should have turned the case over to the FAA Compliance Enforcement Division so that someone in the FAA could track all of this. And third, they needed to update the FAA database to reflect the status of Philip's certificates. Unfortunately, the truth is that the 30 days came and went, and the temporary certificate expired on November 8th, 2021, yet Philip continued to work for ProFlight Aero for at least 10 more months, where he allegedly conducted at least 40 flights with passengers and was instructing students, including 4 flights with Keith prior to the crash that got Keith killed. And now that you understand more about Philip's background and why he was no longer a flight instructor and never should have been in the plane with Keith to begin with, we need to talk about what really happened on that tragic flight, and then I'm going to share with you the worst part of this entire story. On September 28, 2022, Keith Kozel was almost done with his training to get his private pilot certificate, and this was supposed to be a routine flight out of the Allentown Queen City Municipal Airport to go to another airfield to practice soft field takeoffs and landings. According to Philip, Keith didn't need to accomplish any more maneuvers for his private pilot certificate, but for some reason on this day, it was determined he needed soft field takeoff practice. Philip said that even though Keith had already accomplished over 30 soft field takeoffs, there was still room for improvement. I'm not sure if Keith was the one that felt he needed improvement or if that was just what he was being told. Either way, Keith boarded the aircraft completely unaware of the fact that Philip was no longer a licensed pilot or a flight instructor. The aircraft they were flying was a 1968 Piper PA-28-140 Cherokee, and one of the things that you need to know about this aircraft is that it only has one door, and that's on the right side of the aircraft. Keith got in first and was sitting in the left seat, and Philip was in the right seat. At the time of the crash, Philip had over 1,300 hours, including at least 700 hours in the Piper Cherokee. And in my opinion, that's more than enough experience to understand how that aircraft performs on takeoff, especially if you're calling yourself a flight instructor. However, what's shocking to me is that in the NTSB final report, which was published in June of 2024, almost 2 years after this tragedy, they said that Philip was a commercial pilot and a flight instructor. I have no idea how they came to that conclusion since the crash happened almost a year after Philip failed his 709 evaluation ride, and there's no mention in the entire NTSB report about that. There's also zero mentioning of the fact that he surrendered his pilot certificate or that he no longer held any valid certificate. My guess is either the FAA database hadn't been updated yet, or the investigator trusted Philip when he marked down on the accident paperwork that he was doing business as a flight instructor, and he lied saying that he had a commercial and flight instructor certificate. According to the investigation, they taxied out for takeoff from runway 25, and if they used the full length of the runway, they had almost 4,000 feet available. But if for some reason they took off from one of these two intersections, they still had at least 2,600 feet remaining. Either way, the NTSB never confirmed where they started their takeoff roll or talked about the takeoff distance required. And this is just very frustrating because this crash was all about aircraft performance on takeoff, and these were just some of the very basic facts that you needed for the investigation. However, I looked it up, and according to the aircraft manual, they needed about 1,600 to 1,800 feet to take off and clear a 50-foot obstacle. That means they have plenty of runway available, and in my opinion, any pilot with 1,300 hours should have been able to immediately recognize that something was wrong when the aircraft wasn't accelerating like it normally does. Philip said that he believed they should have been airborne at a select point, but they weren't. He never said what that point was, but a good spot would have been the intersecting runway because that's about 1,500 feet down, and that left them plenty of room to abort the takeoff if something was wrong. Instead, he let Keith continue the takeoff, and according to Philip, Keith got airborne but then let the aircraft settle back to the runway briefly before getting airborne again. In order to understand what happened next, you need to know the procedure for a soft field takeoff. You're going to set the flaps at 25 degrees and lift off at the lowest possible airspeed, and then you accelerate in ground effect until you get to your best angle of climb speed known as Vx, and then you start your climb. Once you're clear of the obstacle, then you accelerate to your best rate of climb known as Vy and slowly retract the flaps. The reason you need to know that is because according to Philip, although they had the correct flap setting, he said the aircraft took longer than expected to build up to Vx. Philip wasn't certain if it was due to lack of power in the aircraft, but he was ready to take the controls and did so once they reached Vx and rotated immediately. I'm going to stop there for a minute because he's describing the warning signs that were screaming at him to abort the takeoff. When something doesn't look or feel right, you need to abort and figure out what it is, especially when you have plenty of runway left to do so. They managed to clear the trees at the end of the runway, but the aircraft continued to struggle. The procedure said they were supposed to slowly retract the flaps at Vy, but Philip's statement said that once they were clear of the obstacle, they retracted the flaps and they were still at Vx. The truth is that their airspeed was below Vx according to the flight data, and basically they weren't climbing as the terrain in front of them was rising. Philip said he looked out the windows to find a spot for an emergency landing, but all he saw were more trees. Now, I'm not sure if these fields were there in 2022 when this happened, but Philip never mentioned them as an option, and they continued ahead until they eventually hit the trees and the aircraft crashed to the ground inverted. Unfortunately, the NTSB couldn't determine why the engine lost power, but in my opinion, that doesn't really matter because the root cause of this is that Philip never should have been in the plane in the first place. Additionally, Philip had plenty of opportunity to abort the takeoff when the aircraft wasn't performing, but he failed to do so, and now we need to talk about the worst part of the story and where Philip is today. There's no reason this tragedy ever should have happened, and there's still a lot of questions that need to be answered about how the FAA handled things and why the NTSB accident report failed to identify or even mention the pilot certification issues. I think the worst part of this story is what happened after the crash. Remember, there's only one door on this aircraft, and it's on Philip's side of the plane. According to Philip, he lost consciousness when they hit the trees, but he woke up when they were on the ground. He claimed he dragged himself away from the aircraft, which was on fire, and that he pleaded with people to get his student out of the plane. I've got 3 big problems with that statement. First of all, Keith wasn't his student. Keith was a victim, and he didn't deserve this. Second, a witness told a different story, saying that he was the one that pulled Philip from the wreckage, but he couldn't get Keith out in time due to the flames. And third, I don't think there was 1 ounce of remorse in Philip's entire statement, and I felt like all he tried to do was justify what happened. And you know that's fine though, because there's going to be a lot more details coming out soon, because on August 1st, almost 2 years after the crash, the U.S. Attorney's Office filed an indictment charging Philip with involuntary manslaughter, including at least 40 counts of flying an aircraft with passengers without possessing an FAA airman certificate permitting him to do so. If you're wondering where Philip is at, he pleaded not guilty and was released on bail. The charges carry a maximum sentence of 128 years in prison, but I'm sure there's also going to be lawsuits that follow, and I hope that Keith's family gets the justice they deserve. And if you want to see another story about a flight instructor that got his student killed, then be sure to watch this video on your screen.